It's fully threaded radio, Unthreaded.
Hi everyone, Eric Dudas with you again. On this Unthreaded edition of Fully Threaded Radio, I speak with a true industry giant, Dr. Salim Brahimi. He's very well known for his work with the Fastener Training Institute and also as Director of Engineering and Technology at the Industrial Fasteners Institute. Dr. Brahimi chairs several industry standards committees and is the recipient of numerous industry honors, including the prestigious IFI Soaring Eagle Award. I'm sure many of you listening to this podcast are his past students, so you already know that Salim has an encyclopedic knowledge of fasteners and a wide range of applications expertise. But during this discussion, you'll learn a few details about his life that'll explain his passion for the industry and his commitment to share it as widely as possible. We also take a look at a couple of new programs he's driving at the IFI in fulfillment of that mission. It explains a lot. Our mission at Fully Threaded Radio is to continue to bring discussions like this one to the fastener industry. To do that, we've got a lineup of amazing sponsors and partners who make our work possible. The title sponsors of Fully Threaded Radio are Linfast Solutions Group and Brighton Best International. Fully Threaded Radio is also sponsored by Buckeye Fasteners, BTM Manufacturing, Eurolink Fastener Supply Service, FCH Sourcing Network, Global Fasteners, InSequel Software, Cresa, Fastener Technology International, Jaylan Franco, MW Components, Solution Industries, 3Q Inc., Volt Industrial Plastics, and Worth Industry USA. I always try to get some kind of a scoop when I do these interviews, and this time I got Salim to drop a few details on some important changes that are coming down the pike for a few fastener standards, one of them related to hydrogen embrittlement. I know I caught a lot of people's attention with that. And hang on until the end to find out what he really thinks about Carmen Vertullo. There will be several links in the show notes on this one today if you want to get in touch with Salim or follow up on some of the things that he's going to mention. Here now is my conversation with Dr. Salim Brahimi. Salim, thanks for being here. Tell me, what is the function of the Director of Engineering and Technology at the IFI? That's your current position. What do you do there?
I represent the interests of our members on all levels, technical. So there are three aspects to it. One is the development of fastener standards. IFI has historically been the repository of fastener standards, and then eventually those standards began being developed in consensus standards development organizations like ASME and ASTM. And so the technical director kind of ushered that process and is very involved in the maintenance of those standards. Obviously, those standards are developed by input from all stakeholders, but the technical director of the IFI, whether it was my predecessor, Joe Greenslade, or his predecessor, Charlie Wilson, or his predecessor, has a big say in the evolution of these standards to try to make them as good as they can be. So that's a big part of my work. And there are multiple standards organizations. So there's ASTM, there's ASME, Committee B18 on fasteners, Committee B1 on threads. There's SAE Fastener Committee. There's our own IFI Technical Committee where we manage our own standards as well as sort of collaborate with our members to get input for the other standards. There's on the metric side, ISO, which functions, using the same concept of consensus building, but here you're not representing yourself or your company, you're representing a country. And so it's one country, one vote, and the protocol is more hierarchical. But basically, it's the same thing. The people around the table are colleagues and very often friends, and we collaborate. And at the end of the day, we reach consensus on how to, what should be included or not included in the standards. So that's a big part of it. The other aspect is providing technical support to our members as well as the industry at large And beyond sort of answering questions of a technical nature, it also means finding ways to make standards of various types accessible to the community. And our Fastener Standards book, our IFI book of Fastener Standards, is a foundational tool that we've used over the years to offer the standards in one large collection to everybody in the industry.
It's the Bible.
It's the Bible, exactly. And now we have a digital version of that, or an online version of that. You can, rather than buy the book, you can subscribe to a membership, but it's the same idea. And then the third aspect is part of our mission is to train people in the industry. And Lawrence Klaus, whom you know well, he's the director of training at the IFI, and I collaborate with him very closely to offer the programs that we do offer. He does the delivery, and I give him feedback and input, and sometimes I help him teach the classes. And we do that through our IFI members, but also with very, very close collaboration with Fastener Training Institute. In fact, I was teaching at Fastener Training Institute before I even joined IFI. So that's the training aspect. So those are examples of the types of things that IFI technical director gets involved in.
All right. Well, ask a PhD a question and you're going to get a thorough answer. And I just did.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Well, thanks for all that. I was thinking about, as I considered what to discuss during this conversation, how much impact you've had on so many careers in the fastener industry. And you touched on your role as a trainer, and you were involved with the Fastener Training Institute from before you were even involved with the IFI. How many folks would you say you have touched through your training over the years?
Wow, I don't know.
It's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, each class has an audience of maybe 25 to 40, somewhere in there. And we teach 3 or 4 classes a year. So maybe 100 different students over the years and each year, and multiply that by, let's say, 15. So yeah, I mean, direct training of students attending FTI classes were, somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000. But then there's a lot more interaction. There's interaction with people in the standards committees and young people within the engineering community. And and I also am an adjunct professor at McGill. So that's part of my role, is to help develop young researchers. So yeah, a lot, but it's part of my passion. I love it. I love helping and teaching and educating in any way that I can contribute to somebody's career.
Well, I had the good fortune to sit through the Fastener Training Week back in 2024, and you were there along with Lawrence, and I have to say that your enthusiasm is very obvious, and I was grateful to be able to participate in that. Well, I want to talk about how you got to where you are right now, and we'll get back to some of these things because there's exciting programs that are coming up with the IFI, and you've been involved in so much. Again, it was hard for me to know where to jump into all this. But when we got together today, before we turned on the recorder, I was asking you about what I thought might be a discrepancy in the way your name was spelled. So on your email and everywhere I see it versus LinkedIn, there's an I and a Y at the end of your name. And you had mentioned to me that this was done very intentionally and for a reason. And that took us into a detail about your life that I did not know and is very interesting, especially at this day in history. Share that with us, Salim. That was fascinating.
So I'll start with this part of the story. I have 2 brothers who live in New York. They've been there forever. They're much older than I am. They spell their names with a Y. And I have a sister who, like me, lives in Montreal. And we spell our names with a Y. So half of my family, nieces, nephews, and everybody spells it with a Y, and the other half spells it with an I. So for me, it was just, a way to distinguish my name, because there are a lot of Brahimis with an I other than myself. And I did it deliberately to make me more findable, or, have the name that is distinguished. But I didn't make it up. Like I said, half of my family use the Y and the other half use the I. So I did it for that reason. Now, your question was about my background. I was born in Iran in 1966, and by the time I was 11 years old, 11, 12 years old, the revolution in Iran happened, and I'm Jewish, and I was part of a Jewish community in Iran at the time. A lot of us after the revolution were either compelled or had to escape, or there are a number of reasons why the environment became very inhospitable to us. So my parents managed to get me out of the country and brought me to Canada, and then they went back to Iran to try to see how they could extricate themselves, sell the house, and get themselves out. And then the war with Iraq started, and the revolution got hijacked, and they got stuck there for 4 years. So I grew up in Canada with my aunt and my sister, who's 17 years older than I am, kind of taking care of me until my parents were able to leave. And my brothers, in the meantime, were in the States. They went to university in the States. They're, again, also much older than I am. So they had already left, and they were studying at Lehigh University in the 70s, and then settled in New York City. So that's how the family history evolved to where it is today.
What a story. So you're watching current events with a very keen eye, aren't you?
Definitely. So I have to tell you a little anecdote. When I was a kid, we used to take a direct flight to go from Tehran to Tel Aviv because the two countries had very close, friendly relations. And now the only things going back and forth are missiles and bombs. So it's a sad day in that sense. But I guess all I can say is, I'm hoping that what's happening is going to end up resulting in a change in the regime in Iran. And I'm not alone in that. All Iranian expats, wherever they are, have the same hope. But then there's a lot of anxiety because, your country is being bombed. So my spouse, my wife, Sarah, is Iranian. She emigrated to Canada from Iran about 10 years ago. So she has family. A lot of her family are in Iran, and I have a lot of family in Israel. So we have this situation where we're calling our families back and forth to make sure that they're okay, and they're being, bombed in both directions. So it makes for an interesting situation, and it highlights the complexity of this relationship between Iran and Israel and Muslims and Jews, and don't believe all the horror stories in terms of the interpersonal relationships, but we have a regime in Iran that is antithetical to world peace and antithetical to stability in the region, and they've done horrible things. So I hope their days are counted, and soon the Iranian people will be able to reclaim their country. And it's such an amazing country with so much potential and history and culture and wealth that we rediscover the country as it should be.
Amen to that. Hard to know what's going to happen now. My question to you would be, based on what you hear from your families over there, both countries, do you think that they have a clear idea about what's happening? I mean, are they able to use social media? What is the news telling them? What's your feel for all that?
Well, in Iran, again, so this is my wife's family. There's a blackout. So the internet is heavily restricted. So since the war started, there's no direct communication, or very difficult to have direct communication. And this was also true in January when they massacred tens of thousands of people in the street. They blacked out the internet. So they know what the deal is. The majority of people understand exactly what's happening, but they may not be getting, the same immediate news that we're getting here. But they see it and they feel it and they know what the deal is. They're all opposed to the regime, minus 10%, who have, all the power and the weapons. In Israel, it's different. In Israel, they feel like they've been under direct threat by Iran for decades. Literally from day one of the revolution, but it became more critical with Iran's nuclear aspirations. So they've always felt under threat, and they're gritting their teeth and bearing the consequences of this, hoping that, again, the threat diminishes with time. But you need more than what's happening now for that to happen. You need a change of government, you need infrastructure, you need a lot of things to happen in Iran. So there's a long road ahead, unfortunately. But they're on board with trying to do this, unlike outside where, a lot of people are questioning why are we doing it in the first place.
Can you tell from what you're hearing if the devastation over there is very widespread, or is it more isolated, more surgical, as we're told?
No, there's nothing called surgical when you're dropping bombs. They're targeting the ability for the regime to send drones and send missiles and send ballistic missiles, but innocent people are getting caught in the middle and getting killed. And unfortunately, my wife's cousin, one of her cousins, who's a young engineer working at a car factory, going back home from work, and he ended up getting killed that way. There are multiple stories like that. There are a lot of people like that, but obviously, the objective is to degrade Iran's ability to fight back.
Right.
And the regime's ability to fight back. Unfortunately, innocent people get caught in the middle. And I contrast that to what the regime did 2 months ago, where they massacred, estimates go between 30 and 40,000 people in a matter of 3 days. So, just to give you an example of, when you're trying to kill people, it doesn't take much. And that's not the case with what's happening now. But unfortunately, as I said, innocent people get caught in the middle.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing all that. I completely did not expect to begin our conversation with all this, but when you indicated that this was the case, I felt like this is a part of how you got to be where you are. It's an important thing that's going on in the world. And again, thank you for discussing it with me.
My pleasure.
You picked up your PhD in mid-career. You told me it was 2017, I believe. You finally iced that cake. That is an amazing achievement. As I was reading more in your bio info, I also saw something that caught my eye, that it had a lot to do with hydrogen embrittlement, which is sort of a fetish topic of mine. And you're very much of an expert on hydrogen embrittlement. Tell us about your PhD experience.
Well, I started my career in the fastener industry working in Canada for Infasco. And we had a policy at the time. Well, I worked at the electroplating and coatings division of Infasco. So we did all the coatings for the bolts. And we had a policy of not baking grade 8 bolts. And at that time, that was almost unheard of. It was assumed that you had to bake a grade 8 electroplated bolt to prevent it from failing from hydrogen embrittlement. So my boss at the time and big mentor of mine, Joseph Bahadrian, said, "You know what, Salim, we got to work on this topic. Let's start doing some testing. Let's collaborate with others." And so that got me involved in doing some testing with other fastener manufacturers and Dr. Lou Raymond out in California. We created a consortium and did a lot of testing, and the outcome of that testing was an ASTM standard on how to qualify plating processes for the risk of hydrogen embrittlement. That's ASTM F1940, and I led that task group that created the standard. So after we created the standard, I had this idea of, okay, well, we have a method. Why don't we use it to do some fundamental research to explain things? And we have, unfortunately, a situation where different standards say different things. Sometimes they're contradictory. In the fastener industry, we believe we don't need to bake anything that's below 39 Rockwell C, but there's a lot of pushback against that. And then there are other industries that take it for granted. And so why don't we do some research? And so I started drumming the beat, trying to get some money from different interests, including the IFI, to do this research. And then I approached Professor Steve Yu, who's now my colleague, and I'm going back 26, 27 years ago when I had my first conversation with him about the topic, saying, there's interest in my industry to do research on this field. Why don't we try to get a grant and start the process? And, we'll do that. So that idea kind of percolated for a while, but it was very difficult for me to have the time to champion the cause the way that it needed to be. And by 2002, I'd been living in Michigan, working for a company in Michigan for 3 years. And then I left that job to move back to Montreal. But one of my objectives was to start my own company with the mission of creating the scenario for this research to actually happen. So it took another 2-3 years after that to get all the funding together, apply for the grants. Our grant got approved. And then by 2005, we started doing research. And by then I said, okay, I want to be one of the students doing the work. So I applied and started a master's program at my own alma mater at McGill, doing research on platings. And then after that, after I completed the master's, I embarked on the PhD program. And by then, our research lab was growing and we had more students coming in and more grants coming in. And I had a dual role, both as a student as well as sort of a supervisor of the program because of my experience. And Steve, you gave me a lot of leeway to lead that initiative. And so I completed my own PhD by 2017. It was a 10-year journey, very hard to do when you have a family, when you're working, trying to support a family, kids, activities, and I was doing it part-time, so it really took a toll on me. But I managed to get it done by 2017, and then the lab itself, the facility, which we call the McGill Hydrogen Embrittlement Facility, has grown and has done some incredible research, not only in the field of fasteners, but in the aerospace industry with the initiative to replace cadmium with zinc nickel. A lot of that research was done at McGill University under our supervision. So that's kind of the backdrop. Now we're continuing to grow, continuing to evolve. And for me, it's a passion. I love doing the research, and it's very complementary to my work in the fastener industry. The research continues to inform and guide us as we revise standards. And I'm really happy to say after all these years that pretty much all the standards now agree on what should or shouldn't be baked. We all agree that below 39, you don't have to bake. You do have to bake above 39, Rockwell C. And if the customer wants to pay you to bake something that's below that, that's entirely their prerogative. But technically it's not required because the material is not susceptible to hydrogen damage. So that was a big contribution of all the research over the years. You do the research and you transfer that knowledge to the industry and the standards practices in the industry. And that was my mission, was to take that knowledge and use it to guide the evolution of these standards on this topic.
What a monster achievement, actually a pile of them. Can you fill in the blank a little bit for people who are not research scientists or academics? When you say you're doing all this research, give us an example of what would that look like actually? What do you do in a given day? How does it work?
So right now I'm an adjunct professor at McGill University, which means it's not a teaching position per se. It's not it's a job, it's a title, but it's not how I earn my living. So what I do is I spend whatever time I have to try to find opportunities and bring industry in to fulfill their needs through the research. So it might be, the aerospace industry is looking for, ways to, implement zinc nickel for landing gear components. What does that mean? So, we cooperate with different aerospace companies that build landing gears or aerospace primes to try to help them solve those problems. It could be, trying to find materials that are more resistant to hydrogen damage. So designing alloys that have microstructures and trapping capacity for hydrogen that makes it so that they resist better, when they're exposed to hydrogen. And then there's the aspect of coatings, finding ways to develop coatings that will, when they interact with the environment and with corrosion, that they minimize the risk of generating environmental hydrogen embrittlement in the material. So those three aspects. And so what I kind of sit between the research and the industry. I got that sweet spot in the applied and the scientific side of the research. So as I said, I'm the one that has the contacts in the industry and brings people in to help them find solutions through the research. And then I also co-supervise the students that are the PhD students that are doing the work. I teach them, I advise them, I show them how to do things. I review their papers, I give my input on the direction of the research and all sorts of things. So from that perspective, it's very, very enriching.
You received the IFI Soaring Eagle Technology Award back in 2015, and that was in connection with your work on hydrogen-induced failures. So you've got a long track record at this, Salim.
Yeah, I mean, I'm honored. I was honored by that award. I was honored by the recognition that the industry has given me. Like I said, honored and humbled by it. But I'm just following my passion and trying to make good things happen.
A lot of times with people who are really deep into research, at least in my experience, engineers, which you're also an engineer, obviously, they don't tend to be very extroverted, or they don't really have a lot of leadership. They're not known for their leadership qualities, but you have that. Reading more into your bio, prepping up for this conversation, I also noticed that you're a soccer coach. How did that fit into all this? I'm guessing that one of your daughters is a soccer player.
Yeah, no. So I've coached both men's and women's teams at the highest amateur levels at university. So I coached the men's team at McGill University, and then took a hiatus from coaching. And then one of my former players at McGill took up the coaching job at University of Montreal, which is the rival school on the other side of the mountain. And he convinced me to come back to coaching. So, and that was a very different experience, learning the fine differences between coaching men and women, and extremely, extremely rewarding either way. And yeah, so great success that way. I was an introvert when I started out in my life. And what brought out the ability to communicate and be part of a team was soccer, because I played soccer. It was my passion, my life. I played varsity soccer at McGill University. I played semi-pro ball after that. Yeah, so I was very quiet and introverted, but the sport brought the spirit of being part of a team, pulling together, having each other's back, and verbalizing your instructions, your emotions in a way that is very different from how I started out in my own personality.
So you pushed yourself outside of your own envelope. Very interesting, because you are kind of a soft-spoken guy, but you speak up when you need to, don't you?
Yeah, I can be very loud on the sidelines coaching. Very, very loud. I coach my kids as well through youth soccer, and sometimes I was told, to tone down a little bit, because I was that passionate about, the game, and wanting to help the kids perform and so on. So
that's good. I have a hard time imagining you as a soccer hooligan, Salim.
Yeah, not a hooligan, but definitely passionate.
Isn't the World Cup being hosted in part by Canada in 26?
Yeah, well, the World Cup is being hosted by North America, which is pretty apropos, because IFI is a North American organization. We have, obviously it's based in the U.S., and we have, a large Canadian membership contingency and a couple of members from Mexico. And this World Cup kind of reflects that. It's being hosted by North America. The lion's share of the games are going to be in different U.S. cities, and then there are going to be games in Canada and Mexico as well. So it's going to be an interesting event. I'm looking forward to it, and hopefully it brings the continent back together.
Well, that's the idealized role of sports, isn't it? You were telling me earlier that you learned to speak French in school, and you, of course, are there in French-speaking or partially French-speaking Canada. And last year, there was a hydrogen embrittlement conference in La Rochelle, France. And that was a giant event, wasn't it? You had a big role in it.
Yeah, I co-chaired the conference. In fact, It was an ASTM conference, and I'd done a lot of research and collaboration with the researchers at La Rochelle University and the profs over there. In fact, I did a good chunk of my PhD analysis with their help. So we were attending a conference in the International Hydrogen Conference in Utah in 2022 or 2023. And one of my colleagues from La Rochelle said, I'd like to organize a conference or workshop at La Rochelle. I said, great idea, because I do this workshop at ASTM every year. And before COVID, we wanted to start a full-blown conference, and it fell apart because of the pandemic. Why don't we join forces and do it together? So that led to the conference that we had last year in La Rochelle, and it was a big success. It was attended by lots of people from all over the world. We had some of the top researchers and students, and it was a great audience, and it was a great setting. That's a beautiful, beautiful town on the coast of the Atlantic in France. So I was very pleased with it. And we have tentative plans to do the next one in Montreal in 2028. So stay tuned.
Okay, now this is a complete layman's kind of question, so please have patience with me, Salim. But isn't hydrogen embrittlement by now pretty clearly understood? I mean, why do you have to have these ongoing conferences about it? Why is that?
You would think that we understand everything about hydrogen embrittlement, but we don't. We fundamentally know what hydrogen does in materials, in different materials, whether it's steel or other materials, like titanium, aluminum, etc. But there are so many different variables that play a role that turn on or off the risk of embrittlement that it's very difficult to understand the synergies between everything all the time. It's always a moving target. So to give you an example, you can have a high strength bolt, because we're talking about fasteners, that is exposed to a lot of hydrogen. But if it's not stressed beyond its threshold, then, it won't break. But if it's stressed beyond its threshold, then it will break. So that's an example of one of the variables. The other variable is if you have a very susceptible material that doesn't get exposed to hydrogen, somehow you manage to block the entrance of hydrogen into the fastener, then, you avoid the problem. Another way is to find ways to trap hydrogen in the materials, and that means understanding the interaction between hydrogen and the materials. Where does it get trapped? What type of trap sites? Are those reversible traps or irreversible traps? How much energy does it take to release those traps? And so that's a very complex equation right there. And it has to do with the interaction with hydrogen in the material, the microstructure of the material. So a lot of research continues to be done, and you would think it's a mature topic, but it isn't, because now we're potentially moving to green sources of energy. So hydrogen fuel is one example. So the question is, well, does hydrogen gas cause the same problems as opposed to electrochemically sourced hydrogen? Yeah, so the mechanism is the same, but how hydrogen gets into the material is different because it's from a gas phase. And so there's a lot of research being done now to develop materials for hydrogen storage and hydrogen transportation, like pipelines that are being used for natural gas are being converted to hydrogen pipelines. And you have to know how to test the material and how to qualify material to be suitable for hydrogen gas transport or storage. So those are examples. You're right. You would think it's a mature topic, but there's so much that we don't know still.
Well, I don't know if it was fate or what, but I'm coming up on my 20th year being affiliated, I'll say, with the fastener industry. And I remember going in to visit one of the first distributors that I ever walked into. And the old timer who was in there brought up, just spontaneously, he brought up hydrogen embrittlement. I had no idea what he was talking about, of course, and I had no idea that it would become an ongoing theme of my life and times in the fastener industry. But here we are. So what was the big takeaway from La Rochelle conference? Did you have one? I mean, was there one thing that you were especially proud of that you can point out as a product of that?
I was very pleased to see how many young researchers around the world are doing their PhDs on hydrogen embrittlement and how much enthusiasm there is on the subject, and how each person's work is advancing the knowledge and the science a little bit more. So I saw a lot of promise for the future.
You mentioned Joe Greenslade earlier in our conversation, and he was your predecessor, and he started the Technology Connection, the IFI Technology Connection. You've continued that work. You're pushing it along. Tell us about some of your experiences with Joe.
Where to start? Joe exuded energy, positivity, enthusiasm, and love for the industry. And one of his gifts was to know how to interact with young people to kind of push them along the way. And so Joe played a big part in encouraging me to continue what I was doing, because I met him a long time ago, and he kind of followed me. And then when he succeeded Charlie Wilson as IFI technical director, I believe it was in 2007, in that time frame, he made a special effort to keep in touch with me, keep tabs on me. And he's the one who encouraged me to join Fastener Training Institute to start teaching over there with him at first, with Carmen Bertullo and the crew at FTI then. So yeah, he had this gift of promoting young people, and I was one of many. There are many other people who he interacted with whose career benefited from his input, and so he has a special place in my heart. And succeeding him at the IFI was a big honor, huge responsibility, humbling also, and there isn't a day that doesn't go by that I think, how would Joe think about this, or how would Joe think about that? And he left a legacy. I mean, he was at the IFI for 7-8 years. He left a legacy, and one of his enduring legacies is the IFI Technology Connection. It's an example of his innovative thinking. He thought, we have the book, but what if we took the data out of the book and used it in a relational database to be able to query it and get information very quickly? And that was unique at the time. There still is nothing like it. And, when he came up with the idea in 2009-10, and it took a couple of years, he realized it was much more complicated than he initially thought. But his enthusiasm, as usual, carried the day, and he reached the point where it was ready for public use. And what I've done is I've grown the capabilities of the Technology Connection. Then I also added the online Book of Fastener Standards, so the online version of our Bible, of the book. So together, they are very nicely complementary products that, you need the standard, and you also need to get the technical specifications for a part very quickly. So they both work very nicely together. But your question was about Joe, and like I said, there isn't a day that doesn't go by that I'm always thinking about it.
Yeah, the proverbial big shoes to fill. Those were them.
Yep.
Also, just ahead of you on the director's side, you had Rob Harris, and he was a mega giant as well. Those two together, what a powerhouse at the IFI. Yeah,
so Rob was also somebody who was very supportive, and he was basically he was the managing director of the IFI. It wasn't his decision to hire me; it was a board of directors' decision. But he supported me along the way, and he always wanted to know how I was doing, and how I was coming along with my research. And he had this amazing way about him where, when Joe was trying to convince me that I should consider becoming IFI technical director, he said, Rob is the best boss I ever had. He basically just said, tell me what you need and get to work, keep me posted. I'm going to get out of your way, and I'm going to trust your judgment to do what's best. And that was Rob's style. He surrounded himself with the best people he could get, and then he would get out of the way and let them do their thing. So that was a great situation to work with. When Rob retired, eventually the IFI board hired Dan Walker, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with Dan. He has more of a hands-on approach. He has a technical and an engineering background. He knows what it's like to develop standards. So it's been a different way, but equally fun for me to work with Dan. And the IFI has grown and progressed in amazing ways, in all sorts of ways, in directions with Dan's input. So yeah, altogether, I think we've carried the legacy well.
Yes, you guys are driving some really exciting new programs, which we'll talk about in a minute, Dan and company. And before we get to that, I wanted to spin back to the technology connection and how that's moving ahead, because you're still massaging it and you still have things that you're doing. We were talking again earlier before we turned on the mics about how you're thinking about AI impacting all this. It's something that you ignore at your own peril. We don't have a lot of the answers, but could you just summarize what your general thoughts are on what we have to deal with in this new coming age of AI with regard to fastener standards?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person to speak to the subject. All I know is we can use, and we and people in the industry use AI to collect technical information or to extract technical information in a manner that is much quicker than opening the standard and reading it page by page. So it certainly makes information more easily accessible. I still question its accuracy because standards are relatively complicated. The devil's in the details when it comes to the requirements, the way they're spelled out. There are always exceptions, and that was one of the complications of building the technology connection was knowing what those exceptions are and building it into the script, into the relational database. And, from my experience, you get the 80-20 rule out of AI. You get answers that sort of satisfy 80% of the criteria, but maybe not the discrete 20%. And you have to be very careful. Nothing substitutes opening the book and looking at the standard and understanding and questioning, well, why is this or why is that? And you don't get that from AI, at least not today. And if one day AI replaces us completely, then the question will be moot. But right now, we need it. We need to have humans interpreting the requirements and standards.
I wonder a lot, though, about the access, and I guess it comes into this question of who owns the information, or practically who owns it. It's so accessible these days. And then if the LLMs that contain, say, a IFI standard, if they're out of date, just like you said, you don't know if you're dealing with the latest and greatest, but it may become so easy to access and so convenient and even so habitual. Let's face it, for a lot of people, they turn to the AI first, that there's a big risk there. So I don't know how it all turns out, but I think these are all things that we're going to just have to watch. And, well, we're all on for the ride, Salim.
Yep, we sure are.
Speaking of riding, and to turn the subject completely to a different idea, you told me you were skiing earlier this morning. Now, here in semi-rural Northeast Ohio, we do have a little chilly weather, but no snow in sight, really. You're up in the Great White North. You're still skiing.
Yeah, we have a cottage outside of Montreal in the Eastern Townships. It's about 7-8 miles north of the Vermont border in the mountains. And we spend our weekends here. Skiing is a big sport for our family, and so we had a nice snowfall yesterday, and I took the opportunity. I said, I can't miss it, and I got to ski some nice powder this morning, so I really enjoyed it. Ironically, I learned how to ski in Iran. That was where I started skiing.
I was just going to ask you where you picked it up. Is that right? Okay, at least I never think of Iran as a big skiing destination. All right, go tell us more.
Well, so the Shah went to boarding school in Switzerland, and there he was exposed to alpine skiing and fell in love with it. And so over the years, he encouraged the development of ski resorts in the mountains. And the mountains north of Tehran are very large, snow-covered mountains, perfect for skiing. And that's it. So, I had the opportunity to ski in those types of mountains that are very similar to the Alps in terms of the terrain. And I loved it from then. And when I moved to Canada, I couldn't figure out how people avoided hitting the trees because there were trees all over the place, and I wasn't used to it. But it was an easy transition for me to adapt to life in Canada because I loved the snow, I loved the winter from my childhood, and I came to a country where the country is winter a good chunk of the year. So if you don't love it, it can be painful. I love it, so that's all I can say.
Yeah, well, that good point on that. Yeah, that must have been really, really traumatic for you at that young age to leave your country. And I'm sure that you said you weren't living with your parents for the first several years. I mean, how did you make it through that?
Yeah, you're right. It's traumatizing and it marks you. I was lucky. There were a lot of people who were not as lucky as I was. But yeah, as a child, you need to be with your family, you need to be with your parents. And I'm better for the experience because what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But it was tough as a kid to go through. And again, fortunately, they were able to escape and make their way to Canada eventually. And then they spent their later years in Canada and Montreal. So what ended up happening was being the youngest in the family, I basically accompanied them through their old age until their passing. I was always there with them. But that was part of the deal. We were separated, and that was a way to kind of make the ends meet in terms of our relationships.
Do you ever look back and consider all of that and think about how you might have developed the fortitude to achieve all the things that you have through that experience?
Yeah, definitely built grit. And it's not just that. Soccer was a big part of my development, but the trauma of the revolution made me be introspective, made me capable of withstanding situations that are difficult. And so, yeah, I am who I am because of it. And there were some scars. They heal, but they're always there. Yeah, so hopefully my kids don't ever have to go through anything like that. But there's something to be said in terms of what we learn from our experiences in life and how it determines the direction we take.
Yes. I think about that kind of generational impact a lot in thinking about my own life and my own family experience. My grandparents came out of Eastern Europe, war-torn by World War I in really crappy situations and made it through Ellis Island. They had that whole experience, the American immigrant experience from that time period.
Wow.
And then my mom and dad were both products of that first generation Americans, but they were tough, because they had that. And of course, right out of the Great Depression. And then, fast forward and you got guys like me, big softies. And I was just going to ask you about your own kids because now they're a generation removed. They didn't have the direct experience. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about whether they truly can appreciate what you endured. I mean, I'm sure you've communicated it to them, but it'll be interesting to see, won't it? Especially what their kids have to go through as the world keeps turning.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want my kids to go through that kind of hardship, and we haven't talked about what my parents went through to get out of the country, but they suffered a lot. They hear the stories. We tell them anecdotally what we've gone through, and that's as far as it goes. Obviously, they haven't experienced it firsthand, but they'll have their own challenges. And I worry about their future quite a lot because of the way the world is evolving.
Right. You're not alone there. Well, let's speak about the future a little bit. The IFI is doing its part to make it as bright as possible. You have a number of programs. I don't know. I know you're excited about all of them. Where do you want to dig in?
Well, so there are a couple of things that we're doing. One of them is what I've dubbed the IFI Emerging Professionals Program. And here we're looking at finding ways to interact more with the younger technical staff at our members, but across the industry at large. And the way that we're proposing to do it is to do it through involvement in the standards development process. So we have this idea of holding a standards camp. Why do we call it standards camp? It's because we'll be spending one day with everybody who's coming to the camp, explaining how the standards development process works, doing mock-ups, role plays, going through the process, the acrimony, the consensus building, whatever it takes. So we're going to create this scenario where they see firsthand what the process looks like. And hopefully through that, they become more engaged in the standards development process, which benefits their employers, the member companies, but also, it increases the communication and the collaboration among the technical people in the industry at large. So the standards development process really helps that. So we also came up with the idea that, okay, once we do this camp, we're going to offer 2 scholarships to applicants. So after the camp, we'll take applications from people who are interested to go further with this. And we'll award 2 scholarships. The scholarships are intended to help pay for some of the travel costs to these different committee meetings. And I've been working with ASTM and ASME to join us in this program. So some of those travel costs will be covered by ASTM as part of their Emerging Professionals program. And as of today, I got news from them that they're fully on board with, our proposal.
Oh, that's awesome.
So the idea is to, get these people to the committees, but it's not enough to get them to sit at the committee meeting, because what happens with, when you're in there for the first time, you're completely intimidated. You don't know what the rules are and how, what's what.
Especially with all that acrimony you mentioned.
Some acrimony at times, not always. But so basically these 2 people who get the scholarships will be paired up with a mentor, 1 or maybe 2 mentors who are very active in these different committees. We'll take them under their wing and get them to dirty their hands right away, proverbially speaking, in terms of working on standards projects right off the bat. Most of everybody who's on these committees, we're all volunteers in a sense, because we don't get paid to do the work per se. So this is like the 3rd or 4th priority in terms of our day-to-day activities, but it's very, very important. And we need help. So having the mentees joined up with the mentors is a great way to not only advance the ball in terms of the standards projects, but also get the mentees to learn as quickly as possible and get them involved with a higher learning rate than they would normally do.
All right, so we're calling this Standards Camp. Is that what the name of it is?
So the one-day event is the Standards Camp, but the larger program is the IFI Emerging Professionals program.
Okay, so I'll put a link to this in the show notes so people can follow up. But in terms of this scholarship application, is that something that we can link also?
The information is going to be advertised this week as we finalize the details of how to do it. By the way, the camp is going to be on April 27th. It's going to be at the IFI headquarters. So you'll see that in the coming 2 or 3 days. And it's going to be open not only to people from the IFI member companies, but also at the industry at large. There'll be a small fee for people who are not part of the IFI membership, but it'll be very affordable to try to encourage as many people to come. So April 27th at the IFI headquarters in Independence, Ohio. Stay tuned. You're going to see some of the advertising in the next few days, 2-3 days.
Okay, if Dan's doing his job.
Well, it's up to me to finalize it and then send it to Dan and Maggie to start sending out to everybody.
All right. Well, mostly these are evergreen shows, but for those of you listening before April 27th, 2026, make sure you check out the link below or go to the IFI website for info on this.
And the opportunity to apply for the scholarships is going to be offered at the camp. And then if enough people are interested, we'll get a bunch of applicants. We'll review the applications and select 2 because we got budgeted for 2 people this year.
I think this is great. A couple episodes ago, we had Darlene Collis on with Linfast Solutions Group. And of course, she's very active with you on some of the standards committees.
She sure is.
Yep. and she was outlining some of the steps that younger people or just anybody interested in getting involved should take. So this is right up her alley. I'm sure she's all on board with it as well.
Yes, she is, and yeah, she's been a great team player in terms of the different things we're doing in the standards committee. So yeah, thank you to Darlene.
All right. So on another front, the program you've got going at the IFI with Marshall Advanced Manufacturing, or their center over there for this apprenticeship program, that's pretty exciting too.
Yeah, so that's the other side of the coin in terms of developing the workforce through apprenticeship programs, and the collaboration with Marshall has been terrific because they basically get different government grants to fund the program. So it's heavily subsidized in that sense, and they make it easy, and there are different programs available. They'll go into your company and tailor what your needs are, tailor a program to what your needs are. And there's a growing list of different types of classes and apprenticeship, whether it's tool making, whether it's cold heading, and so on and so forth. And Lawrence Klaus, our IFI training director, played a key role in collaborating with Marshall to develop the topics and start making those available. So yeah, this is, like I said, the other side of the coin. I'm very excited about it. If you're a company, and you're all in need of training and development, this apprenticeship program is a no-brainer.
The Marshall people put on a little plug at the Midwest Fastener Association meeting a couple of weeks ago. And I was interested to hear that much of their funding comes from the Department of Labor and also the Department of Defense.
Yeah. So like I said, the funding comes from government sources. I didn't know about the Department of Defense, but I knew about the Department of Labor. So you just taught me something new. But it only makes sense for effort, time, and money to be put by the government, whether it's the U.S. government, Canadian government, into maintaining and helping to grow our manufacturing capabilities, our manufacturing base. We all know our challenges with manufacturing is, a global economy, the manufacturing markets move to where costs are lower. So we have to increase our capabilities, make our products with more value added to stay ahead of the curve. And this is one way to do it.
All right. That's the IFI mentorship program. Again, lots of info available on that from the IFI website, which will be linked in the show notes. Well, while we got you on this conversation, Salim, and you have a front row to all of the developments with all the various standards, is there anything earth-shattering coming down the pike that you can drop on us?
Well, the earth-shattering stuff always has to do with hydrogen embrittlement. So we recently, we've spent a few years in ASTM developing a guide for baking and baking efficacy. And we finally passed the last hurdle. So it's been like a 4 or 5 year process where now we're at the point where the standard is it's a guide is being editorially revised by the ASTM editor. So in the next 2 or 3 months or a couple of months, I would hope that it'll be available for the public. But it's basically teaching the user of the standard how to design a baking practice that works, because with baking, not one shoe fits all. Depending on the coating that you're applying, whether it's zinc electroplating or cadmium electroplating or zinc nickel, etc., or chromium or whatever, the recipe needs to be adapted. So the temperature, the time needs to be adapted to optimize, optimize the baking process to make it, work better. And currently what we have is, one size fits all, the same temperature, you vary the time, but really, there isn't much variance there. So this guide is intended to help that process of optimizing the baking process and tailoring it to different coatings. So that's one example. Another one is, so now I'll go to the ISO metric standards. We're developing standards for large size fasteners. So a nut fastener standard and an externally threaded fastener standard for all sizes from M39 up to M100.
Wow.
And that's exciting because it's something that was lacking in the metric side. And then the last one, which is also very, very important, is we're in the process of making it possible to make socket head cap screws to different strength levels. Currently, with the inch products, socket head cap screws can only be made to the ultra high strength 180 KSI level in accordance with ASTM A574. And soon we're going to make it possible to order standard socket head cap screws that are made to lower strength levels, like a grade 8 or a grade 5. And this way, the users of socket head cap screws can order them in a way that matches their application. The problem with the current standard and socket head cap screws is their strength level is so high that they're susceptible to hydrogen embrittlement and hydrogen damage. And that's the one place where we actually have a problem, because sometimes they don't get baked enough and sometimes they're used in corrosive environments. So maybe we don't need, that ultra high strength for all applications. In fact, I know we don't need it for all the applications. Like if you're building office furniture, why do you need a 180 KSI socket head cap screw?
Right.
There's an example. So in the metric side, you can order a property class 8.8 or 10.9 or 12.9, depending on, it's all from the standard list. We're going to adopt that same approach within the next couple of years on the inside.
All right. Very cool. Well, thanks for the insight and the sneak preview, I guess. I want to ask you one more question completely off topic before we get out of here. And I've enjoyed this conversation immensely.
Well, so have I. Thank you very much for inviting me, Aaron.
Long overdue. And we'll do some more stuff coming up. But you mentioned Carmen Vertullo earlier. Of course, he's a collaborator with the Fully Threaded Radio podcast for a long time. Everyone in the industry knows him. For some reason, he has a nickname for you. He calls you Bull Shark, but he wouldn't exactly tell me why that is. I wonder if you could fill me in.
Well, I don't know all the details of the story. All I know is that when we were at the IFI meeting last spring, and it was in Florida. By the way, Carmen was awarded the IFI Soaring Eagle Service Award at that meeting for all of his years of service in terms of teaching and mentoring.
Yes.
He went deep sea fishing and caught a shark. And apparently he had the opportunity to give the shark a name, and for whatever reason decided he wanted to name it Salim Brahimi. So you can get more details from him directly.
So they did one of those tags, and so now it's sort of an official logbook somewhere with your name on it, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And I think the shark, I don't know if it's the actual shark or some rendition of the shark was just sent to him. So.
Oh, is that right? He probably did a repro.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Well, that's a fun story. It sounds like something Carmen would do. He must really have a love for you, Salim.
So I was scratching my head because I wasn't sure, what does that mean? Does he like me or does he hate me? I'm pretty sure he likes me, but it's a bit of a strange way of showing it. But
yeah, well, yeah,
I love him just the same, and I always enjoy having a martini with Carmen.
That's awesome. That's good to hear. Okay, well, you got a lot of fans out there, that's for sure. And again, I really enjoyed this conversation, and we'll do something like this again. Hopefully, though, it'll be a little bit more zeroed in on some of these exciting developments that you've got coming in, and I'll make a point to take care of that with you.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate you inviting me, and I look forward to keeping the industry updated on, like you said, some of the more granular stuff in terms of the standards. There's a lot happening, and I could cover one topic for 10, 15 minutes at a time on one of your future shows.
Yes, I know you can, and we will. Okay, we've been talking with Salim Brahimi, and thank you for all your great work in the fastener industry.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Fully Threaded Radio is a production of Fasteners Clearinghouse.